On today's episode of the ThriveMore podcast, I interview Nick Hutchison. You are going to get a lot of value out of this because he talks about how to read a self-improvement or a business book to get the most value out of it. I can tell you that it's engaging and it's very educational. And I learned a lot on just how to set an intention before you read a book and then how to ensure that you hold yourself accountable to put that book into action. We all read a lot of books and read a lot of information, but do we always act on that information? And Nick is going to show you the blueprint on how to do that in this episode. It's a great one. Nick is the founder of BookThinkers, a business dedicated to helping authors and readers fulfill their potential in personal development. In just 7 years, he has organically built a platform that reaches over 1 million people each month. Nick's podcast, BookThinkers, Life-Changing Books, is a global top 2% show that features captivating interviews and world-class authors. He's also dedicated his life to helping millions of readers take action on the information they learn so they can rise to their potential. This was the inspiration for his new book, Rise of the Reader, where he dives into the strategies for mastering your reading habits and applying what you learn. So we're going to dive into all that. Nick, welcome to the ThriveMore Show.
Roger, I'm excited to be here. I know you said you're also a big reader, so I'm curious, what's your favorite book of all time?
Great question. So my favorite, I have two that I always go back to. For fiction, which I read very, very little of, but I think it was almost written as a factual book, is Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Changed my life. Like, that book just absolutely changed my life. And everybody I've ever talked to that's read it, it's had an amazing impact on them. And it's kind of crazy to see that this woman from Russia in the 50s foretold the future, basically, with the economy and governments. And then I would say that How to Win Friends and Influence People is just the OG, just the OG. I've read that book. The cover has fallen off. I've read that book so many times.
Yeah, How to Win Friends and Influence People was one of the first books that I decided to read. And my favorite takeaway from that book was using somebody else's name. So using a name in conversation. Roger, thank you so much. Roger, great to meet you. And it's, what does he say? It's like the sweetest thing that somebody can hear.
Sweetest sound in the English language. Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Yeah. Well, cool. Thank you, because I've never been asked a question when I've been interviewing somebody right off the jump. And yes, I am an avid reader, and the listeners know that. So this podcast is going to be really fun for me because it's about books. It's about, I think more importantly, how to get the most out of those books. So many people, and I'm guilty of this at times, will read a book, finish it, set it down, and then go on with my life and not really, allow the book to impact my life and to change it. And I know many people do that, where I'm now starting to go back and read books 3, 4, 5 times, because that's what I'm really getting out of it. But Nick, if we can talk about really how you got from there to here. So, what were you doing? And then how did that transform into starting BookThinkers? And then now you're an author, and what was that genesis story?
Well, I appreciate the question. And what might surprise your audience, given the subject of today's conversation, is that growing up, I was not much of a reader. I was more of the athlete stereotype, not really much of the academic. And so you couldn't pay me to read a book growing up. Yeah. And that behavior and that attitude that I had really carried through most of my college experience as well. But I took an internship going into my senior year of college at a local software company. It was a sales internship. And my boss, Kyle, he recognized that I was sort of a know-it-all, thought I knew everything about the world. You can't teach me anything. I'm just like a hardcore hustle type of guy. And he said, hey, listen, man, you commute about an hour each way, 5 days a week. That's 10 hours in the car. Listening to the same playlist or the same radio station, it's not going to change your life, but the right business podcast might. And he basically said, I know you think you know everything, but give some of these shows a shot. A lot of them interview wealthy people, and you can learn something from them. So I took his advice. I started listening to business podcasts. And what I realized very quickly was that so many of the people that I wanted to be like, these business celebrities, right? I defined success from a financial perspective when I was younger, or through a financial lens. And so what I realized was that so many of them were giving at least some credit for their success to the books that they were reading. And so I just kind of had this moment after a while where I realized that if I was deliberately choosing not to read these books, then I was also deliberately choosing to live under my potential. And again, as a competitive sort of know-it-all type of guy, I said, I've got to see what the magic is all about. And so I went to a local Barnes & Noble, I grabbed a few books, and the rest is history. I mean, for the last 10 years, I've been reading an average of probably 50 personal development style books a year. So somewhere north of 500. And that doesn't include second, third, fourth, or fifth time reads. Those are just new books. And I owe everything that I have in my life, all of the success that I've experienced in my health, in my happiness, my relationships, my business, and my personal finances to the books that I've read. And I'm just out here trying to spread the positive power of personal development now.
All right. So I took a look at the BookThinkers website, and that makes sense. Like, I love that you had this epiphany. One, you had a mentor that looked after you and cared about your development, which is wonderful. That's a great gift. And I love that you give so much credit to the books that you've read that's helped with your development. So on your website, you have a saying that I love. We believe the right books at the right time can change lives. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, books have changed my life over and over and over and over and over and over and over in a positive way. And as I started to build this BookThinkers community, you highlighted it during the intro, but we do about 1 million organic impressions a month, sharing books, communicating with people, book recommendations, podcast clips, everything's focused around books. So over the years, I've been fortunate enough to interact with thousands of other people who have told me similar things. Hey, Nick, thank you for putting this book recommendation out there. I read it, I implemented it, it solved my problem, it changed my life. And I've heard that story repeated over and over and over again at conferences that I've attended, webinars that I've attended, all sorts of things. While I'm traveling, sometimes I'll bump into people, digital nomads and stuff like that are reading and implementing these books and using them to change their lives. And so I genuinely believe the right book at the right time can change your life. And if you know how to implement the book effectively, the chances are even higher, which is why I've written my book, Rise Up the Reader, because just like you highlighted before we started talking, so many people are reading these books, and unfortunately, they go in one ear and out the other. But at the end of the day, I genuinely believe, through my own personal experience and hearing feedback from so many other people, that books change lives, and there's something magical about them.
Yeah, for sure. And maybe that that old saying, the teacher appears when the student is ready. It's almost like that second and third, fourth read of the same book, of a high quality book. The student, the reader, us, we're more ready to accept that information, and it for me, I absorb it so much better, that because I think the student, I'm ready for it. I'm actually primed and ready for it. Again, the critical part of this podcast to me is how can we help? How can you help the listeners get more out of what they read? So do you have a process that you teach? Do you have a certain formula that is helpful for most people? Let's dive into that and take your time, because this is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, inside of this book, Rise of the Reader, I literally share dozens and dozens of different strategies that people can use to get more from the books they're reading. And we can go through a couple of them today, maybe sort of chronologically through the process of reading a book.
Yeah.
So step number 1 is to define an intention. I think books solve problems, they build skills, or something in between, but those are kind of the 2 buckets to start with. So is there a problem that you're dealing with on a daily basis that could be removed or solved by reading about how somebody else solved it? Or is there a skill that you're looking to develop personally or professionally to help you get closer to where you know you're capable of going in life? And so those are sort of the 2 kind of first questions that I'd like to ask. Once you define an intention, like here's a problem that I'd like to solve, or here's a skill that I'd like to develop, I think it's all about choosing the right book. And I think, at the risk of boring everybody, I'll just say inside of this book, there are dozens of personal inventory questions and questions that you can ask, methods for finding the right book. You can DM me at BookThinkers on Instagram if you want a custom book recommendation. But once you have the right book, I think here's where the magic starts to happen. Sometimes I'll meet people and I'll say, hey, Roger, what are you reading? And you'll tell me, and I'll say, why? And you'll be like, what do you mean, why? I saw it on Instagram, or, somebody recommended this book to me. Again, I think it's really important to set an intention for each book that we read. And when I say intention, I'm sort of talking about a SMART goal. That's the format that I like to follow. So for anybody that's not familiar with it, SMART is an acronym that stands for specific, measurable, what's not being measured can't be managed, attainable, something that's realistic so that you actually are more likely to take action, relevant, so you're emotionally connected to this outcome, and time bound, give yourself a deadline to take action. And so when I'm reading a book, I like to set a SMART goal. One of the books that a lot of people are reading right now, we talked about him before we press record, is Alex Hormozy's new book, $100 Million Leads. It's a book on lead generation for businesses. Excellent book. But the problem is, again, people are just reading this book, trying to consume the entire thing, and as a result, they don't take any action. So instead, let's set a SMART goal for this book. Something like, find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies for my business BookThinkers by the end of November. That is specific. It is measurable, right? Find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies. It's attainable. I didn't say make $100 million by the end of November. Just find and implement 2 things.
Yep.
It's relevant to my business because frankly, we kind of stink at lead generation. And it's time bound. I said by the end of November. And so what I do with that intention is I write it down on the inside cover of the book and I reread it each time I read a few more pages so I can tell my brain what to filter for. Our brains have this beautiful filtering system called the RAS, the reticular activating system. And a book has so many opportunities to influence us, but we need to tell it exactly what we're looking for. Share your goal with the book by writing it on the inside cover. Find and implement at least 2 lead generation strategies. And so as I'm reading, I'll just, if I see one of those potential lead gen strategies, I'll quickly mark it off. And I'll say, this has the potential to change my life, right? By the end of the book, maybe I've notated 10 or 15 different potential actions. So then what I like to do is I like to rewrite all of them. Repetition leads to retention. It's probably one of the reasons that you love reading books 4 or 5 times, because as you repeat the information, you develop a stronger connection to it, becomes part of your subconscious, and you start to understand it even more. But in the example of $100 million leads, to kind of follow this through the process, let's say you rewrite these 10 or 15 potential actions. What I've learned reading so many productivity books and entrepreneurship books is that not every action is created equal. Some of them have more leverage and are easier to implement. That's what we want to focus on. Yep. So when I rewrite that list, I'll try to simplify them, think about implementing them, and I'll say, what are the 2 or 3 actions? What are the 20% of these that might lead to 80% of the change? That's what I choose to implement. From there, I rewrite those into an online notebook, but I also write those activities into an activity tracking system that I've built out and I describe in the book. And I also share them with my accountability group. So I know that was a long kind of tangent there, but that's a rough estimate of what a book looks like in my ecosystem. You have to choose the right book. Then you have to set an intention. Then you have to read. Something I didn't highlight is I think there's a difference between reading and taking notes, so we should separate the activities and avoid multitasking. We could do a deeper dive on that if you want.
Yeah.
And then as it continues through the process, rewrite the highest leveraged activities that are only related to your intention, decide on the best ones, and implement them. So that's kind of what my process looks like.
I love it. Nick, that is going to help so many people, because I think people pick up books. They've got a great recommendation. They read it. They think, okay, awesome, back to life. And what you just described is the words, you use the word intention. Like, you have to do any action within, especially a business book, a self-improvement book. You have to have intention going into that, so you know what you're expecting coming out of that. Now, you said that you don't like to, or you like to separate the two. So that's funny. I'm guilty of. I like to highlight. I like to write, if it's a business book, both Hormozy books. You know, I've got a bunch of chicken scratch in the margins, and everything's dog-eared, right? So I can find stuff quickly, and I do that while I'm reading. But it sounds like you advocate to maybe separate those two. And can you speak to that?
I do. I read a great book about monotasking by Thatcher Wine a couple of years ago. And it talked about the benefits of focusing on one task at a time. And it talked about the downsides of multitasking, how it can be inefficient. And so just like you, I mean, for most of my reading career, I've been taking notes in real time. But what I realized was that would take me out of the flow state of reading. It was task switching between reading and note-taking back to reading. And it was sort of a bumpy process. So I tried out separating the two. I would read my intention, right? I'm telling my brain what to filter for. And at the very most, through the first time through the book, I'm just quickly highlighting something, maybe circle a page number and highlight the section that I'd like to go back and revisit and reflect on later. But I try not to break that reading flow. I try to quickly notate something, but continue to read. I go all the way through the book, and then I'll go back through a second time. And that second read will be what you're doing. Sitting there, reflecting on the information, taking notes, rewriting the takeaway, trying to simplify it, trying to understand it, trying to teach it to my accountability group. And so it's almost like a second pass through the book, but the second pass through the book is the note-taking section. So I try to read all the way through, then I do the note-taking. And for me, I've found that if you were to sort of measure the two, like reading plus note-taking at once versus just reading and then note-taking, I think that the latter is actually more efficient time-wise.
Yeah.
And then it's also more impactful because, again, you're not task switching in your brain. You're just focused on how can I take action on this? You're like giving yourself space to think about taking action instead of having to jump back into the book again and continue reading.
Yeah. That's funny because I'll almost have like a guilt trip where I'm like, why am I not doing this? Why am I not doing this already? And then my mind goes off to how do I implement, how do I do this? And you're right. It does take you out of the flow of the book. I'm going to just ask a tangential question here. We all will pick up books and we'll read them and then realize, okay, this isn't a stellar book. And I have this dumb thing where but I've started it. I'm halfway through until I realize this book kind of sucks. And I'm not going to name any of those books, but, and none of them that we've talked about today, of course. But I'll finish the damn thing just because I've started it, right? And I've heard, some of my mentors and they're just like, set it down. If it's not quality, set it down. How do you handle that? You get halfway, a third halfway into a book and realize there's just not a lot of meat in this. I'm not learning from this. Do you quit reading it or do you finish it?
When I first started, I would finish it because I was optimizing. I think I was optimizing for the wrong thing. I was optimizing for completing a certain number of books per year. That was my goal. 52, 104, 25, whatever the goal is.
Yeah.
And so to complete a book and to check that off my list, I had to read every word of every page. And over time, as I started to hear how different people manage this, I started to optimize for something different, which was taking action, right? Set an intention to solve a problem or develop a skill or something else. There's a lot of different ways that you can build an intention. And if I realized that the book was either A, not going to help me fulfill that intention, or B, wasn't a good quality book, like didn't offer anything new related to my intention, then I would allow myself to put it down. And I think a great framework for this that people that need like a rule or a framework, Ryan Holiday and Tim Ferriss were talking about this one time on a podcast. They call it the rule of 100. So you take the number 100 and you subtract your age. So for me, I'm 29 years old, 71 is the result. I have to read at least 71 pages of a book before I can put it down. So their thinking is that the older you get, the less you have to read because the wiser you have become. Let's say I was 55, I would only have to read 45 pages. And so it just gives you that kind of minimum number of pages so that you can default to a rule and not feel so guilty putting it down. You're like, you know what? I gave it a shot. I read my 71 pages. This is not going to fit my intention. Give it up. That type of thing.
Oh, I dig that. I totally dig that. So with your business, BookThinkers, and your platform, you're reaching over 1 million people per month. That is, and organically, I believe, that is not an easy task. How did you start? Because there'll be a lot of people listening that are trying to grow a following. And how did you start that process and gain momentum in that process?
Well, about a year after I discovered personal development books, I started sharing the books I was reading on social media. So maybe it was a little bit after that, a year and a half, mid 2017, probably. And as I started to share the books I was reading on social media, I started to connect with a lot of like-minded people who were also providing book recommendations, following our social media accounts. interacting with us, asking questions. And every time somebody would reach back out to me and say, hey, Nick, this book that you recommended, I wasn't aware of it before, but it changed everything for me. I felt so much genuine fulfillment when things like that would happen that I just sort of became addicted to the social media process of growing this account and interacting with more people. I was fueled by this positive feedback and the impact that I was capable of making. And as that account continued to grow over time, I started to focus on social media as a business, which was new to me because just like reading, I was also not a social media guy growing up. Again, I'm in my late 20s today. So as a lot of these platforms started to emerge, I was a very late adopter. Was not a big Facebook guy, never used some of these other platforms like Snapchat. And so again, I really got into the mechanics of how social media would work because I wanted to optimize for feeling good and creating a positive impact. Then there was a monetary sort of benefit to getting involved in these platforms because authors started to reach out to me and they'd say, hey, Nick, we love your reviews. Can we pay you to review our books? And what I realized was that the bigger my following was, the more impressions we had on a monthly basis, the more an author would pay because I could sell more books into my audience. So now there was a monetary incentive to get better at social media. So there are all sorts of strategies that I could share with you if you're interested on how to get more from the books that you're reading. But that's why I started to grow this account. And I just realized, I think at the end of the day, that if you provide value to an audience, it will continue to grow because people will share your content, and the social media algorithms, they're all based on value. They want you to provide value. They don't want to promote bad content because they're pumping advertising into these platforms. And if as a user of these platforms, you were just scrolling through bad content and advertising, you'd leave. But if there's good, educational, valuable, entertaining content, plus a little bit of advertising, you'll stay and they'll make money. So that's what I realized. And, I'm happy to go into some strategies and stuff, but that's why I started the accounts and then why I got interested in growing them.
That's super cool. Super cool. So you've had the opportunity to interview, because you have a podcast as well, and you have the opportunity to interview some big names. Alex Hormozy, as we talked about, Grant Cardone, of 10X fame and obviously a real estate magnate. What one or two interviews have really impacted you? So of course you're interviewing them for your audience, but I've found as a podcast host, I'll leave some interviews and go, wow, that changed me. I get to sit down with some really smart people, and that helps me grow as well. Are there one or two interviews that you'd be open to share that really kind of changed you, opened your eyes, exposed you to something that you hadn't been before?
Yeah, of course. Well, I remember when I was first starting the podcast, I thought, what type of value am I going to get from this? And I heard Tim Ferriss say one time that if you follow your genuine interests and curiosity during an interview, you're using it as a coaching session. And so even if nobody listens to it, there's still value to hosting the conversation. And I think podcasting is one of the greatest ways to bypass paying somebody for coaching. Sure. You could get it for free, right? Cardone I heard Hormozy say once that I think he paid Cardone $50,000 an hour for coaching. And so it's like, I can get Cardone to coach me for free just because I have a podcast, right? So how cool is that? Favorite interviews are the most valuable interviews. The first one that comes to mind is author Steven Pressfield. He's written a number of best-selling books, including The War of Art, which has sold millions of copies. He's been interviewed on Rogan a bunch of times and some pretty big platforms. Steven Pressfield is 80 years old. He lives in Malibu. He really didn't have any success with his writing until his mid-50s.
Wow.
So I had a chance to go to his house earlier this year and sit down for an interview. And when he talked about working from his early 20s until his mid-50s on his passion of writing without making any money or having any success, but delaying that gratification, putting in the work, becoming a professional, getting better at the craft. And again, 30 straight years of working. I talked to him a little bit about, I think, some of the issues that I have with my generation, right? I'm, at the end of the millennial curve. But people in their 20s today, they just don't seem like they want to work. They have instant gratification. They want it tomorrow. And being able to sit in front of somebody who's so successful and humble and worldly and realizing that it took him 30 straight years to find any success, right? That wasn't like his big break. That was just like the first time somebody paid him $1 for his writing. I realized that I have a long time to go. And that was very comforting to me. And it was such an amazing conversation. He provides so much value. He sort of feels like a father figure, a grandfather figure, just like a bonus in my life, because I do have an amazing family too. But that one
that's cool.
Really sticks out to me.
You just lit up when you talked about that. That was really cool to see. Yeah. And that's 30 years. That's the ultimate marshmallow test, right? Where you just delay the gratification over and over and over. And that's the game, and especially in business. And writing is business, but that is the game. Anybody else off the top of your head that was also, again, more so impactful to you, not necessarily maybe your audience, which I'm sure had an impact too, but.
Yes. And I was thinking about him yesterday, so this is probably why he's coming to mind.
Yeah.
But Robert Greene, Robert's written a number of best-selling books, including The 48 Laws of Power. And I went into that interviewing him about The 48 Laws of Power, thinking that the book was written so that other people could use the tools in there to take advantage of other people, right? It was like all about implementing power games. But what was really interesting is Robert told me that he wrote the book to expose the Hollywood elite that would like pretend to be for the best causes, but in the background, they're just playing money games. And so he actually wrote the book so that people could defend themselves against other people trying to take advantage of them. And I thought that was a really interesting way to view the book. It totally flipped like my intention for the book. And I've been able to, I think, protect myself in a big way against some people that wanted to take advantage of certain business situations. So that one, just because we did some stuff with him yesterday, is coming to mind, but another really powerful interview for me.
Yeah, cool. I was fortunate. I saw him speak about a year ago or so with Ed Milet, and kind of a quiet guy, right? He is brilliant, and he does such in-depth research. So it was really, and he gave a quote. It's not his quote, but he had the quote that I'll never forget because it had such an impact on me. A man never stands in the same river twice, because the river's never the same, nor is the man. And that is so profound, so profound. That's cool that you got to interview him. Let's talk about your book. So I think coincidentally, my producer of this podcast and my director that handles a lot of this is going to launch this episode on the day your book launches. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think they did that on purpose in November. So talk to me. You talked a little bit about Rise of the Reader, but if you can, what's even more important is, what should the intent be? That's what I'm trying to ask. What should the intent be of the reader when they pick up your book, Rise of the Reader?
Sure. I'll tell you why I wrote it first. So over the years of building this community, like we've talked about, I've had the chance to interact with a lot of people that are getting into the world of personal development, looking for book recommendations, looking to get more from the books they're reading. And as a result, I've answered the same questions hundreds of times. How do I find the right book? How do I set an intention for the book? How do I take good notes? How do I retain more? How do I implement more and change my behavior? And I would always answer people. I mean, I am genuinely motivated by impact. And so if I could help somebody in their journey, like, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
But what I realized was that I was also underserving those same people that I was attempting to help for two reasons. Number one, the medium with which I was answering questions, Instagram DMs, or maybe a quick Zoom call or typing out an email, never lent itself to like the full explanation I knew that I could give. And then number two, I had never actually taken the time to define my own strategies. Like, I was just doing, right? I was just implementing books. And so I didn't even know how to articulate what I was doing or give somebody a roadmap to follow. And so I was presented with an opportunity to write the book. And I said, yeah, this is the book I want to write. And so it took me actually about 3 years working off and on to document my own behavior, to sit back and sort of observe it from a third party perspective and say, what the heck does Nick Hutchison do to implement books so effectively? Because over the last 10 years, I've literally designed my dream life. I'm happy, I'm healthy, I'm wealthy, I have great relationships, and it's all a result of implementing these books. Again, because they condense decades of somebody else's lived experience into days. So we've mentioned before, because of the rule of 100, I'm 29 years old, but if you include the books behind me, I'm like thousands of years old
Sure.
because I've consumed thousands of years of other people's experiences. So I just believe in these books. That's kind of reason number one. And then reason number two, most people are not reading effectively. They're not implementing information efficiently. And I want to go out there and help people solve those problems, especially the young, motivated professionals who know there's a difference between where they are and where they want to be. And they're reading these books, but the books just aren't doing it for them. But I'm like, they could be doing it for them.
Sure.
They just don't know how. So anyway, that's why I decided to write the book. What's the intention? So I actually do have a little exercise in here right in the beginning for the reader to define a SMART goal for this book.
Okay.
And I think a good intention could be something like find and implement at least 2 new note-taking strategies that you can use with the other books you read by the end of the year. Or, find and implement at least 2 new retention or action strategies that you can implement by the end of the year. And so in the second half of this book, I've included over 100 healthy, wealthy, and happy habits that I've implemented from the 500 plus books that I've read to give so many examples of things that I've implemented, what my experience looked like, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything in between, to show everybody that you can implement even the most difficult books out there to change everything, everything in your life. So that was a ramble a little bit, but hopefully, connected the dots.
That's fantastic. We'll and of course we'll be promoting this podcast when the day your book comes out. So we'll get the press that it deserves because I think it can help people. All right, so I have to then flip the script on you that you started the podcast with. So what is one or two of your favorite books, and more importantly, why and how they impacted you?
Yeah, I do think that 5% of the books I've read have probably created 95% of the change in my life, right? Yep. So there are a lot of them, maybe 25 favorite books, but I'll give a couple today. So the first one that comes to mind is The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. When I read that book, I was working a traditional 9-to-5. I was just starting to think about BookThinkers as a side hustle and as a place to share my book reviews. And within a few months of reading that book, I took my location-dependent job and it became location-independent. Then I started to automate so much of what I was doing within that role so that I could focus more time on my side hustle. I also started traveling the world. My wife and I, over the last 5 or 6 years, have visited 25 different countries, sometimes for up to 3 months at a time because the business is a remote location-independent business. Yeah. And all of that is a result of Tim's work. Now, because I read that book, I also got into Tim's podcast, and I've just heard so many amazing, actionable interviews as a result of Tim's work. So I'm a big fan of Tim Ferriss, and I'm a big fan of the book, The 4-Hour Workweek. Again, it just teaches you that reality is negotiable, and you can design a life that's uniquely fulfilling to you. You don't have to follow society's predetermined roadmap for what your life should look like. You can design something unique. So that's number one. I'll mention one more. I love The Compound Effect by Darren Hardy. It's one of my favorite books. It teaches you that small steps in the right direction, repeated over a long period of time, will lead to disproportionately positive outcomes, meaning the same little input to a system as it compounds can just push you in a drastically different area. He uses an example in the book. He says, imagine a plane is taking off from Los Angeles and heading to New York City. But before it takes off, the nose of the plane is just nudged 1%, let's say to the south. As that 1% compounds, it's essentially imperceptible for the first half of the flight. You wouldn't even notice. But by the end of that flight, 3,000 miles later, you're 150 miles south, somewhere in Delaware. Yeah. So what 1% changes can you make in your health or your wealth, your happiness, your relationships that can compound over the next 10 years and lead you to a completely different place? So I think about those 1% changes all the time because they're attainable, they're manageable. Yeah. How do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? And so many of us, we think, we have to have that big change. I think thinking big is great, but sometimes that stunts our action in the short term. And so that book removes any of that and just puts you in a good headspace.
It's so funny you mentioned those two books. I've read both those books and they're great. However, I recently read The Compound Effect and I was ready for it and I've used it, and in my health, my wellness, I will think of that book before I'll take a bite of a cookie, because it's that 1%, right? I will go work out when I'm dead tired because Darren Hardy's in the back of my mind. But Nick, I read you were probably still in high school when I read the 4-Hour Work Week, and I was in my early 30s, and I wasn't ready for that book. That book didn't change my life because I was on the path that I was supposed to be on. Society told me to be on, working up the corporate ladder, getting rewarded for going up the corporate ladder. Now I really cherish that book, and I understand what he was saying. I wasn't ready to hear it back then. And just another, example to where we talked about this student, being ready when the teacher will appear. You read that book at the right time in your life. You were looking for that, and that book served you so well. So that's another example of, man, keep all those books in your personal library, because you never know when you can go back and grab one and it speaks to you in a very, very different way. Because that book impacted you and me very differently. We read the same book and had very different results from it. Yeah. Thank you for sharing those. That's really cool. And I love the context that you gave behind that too. So last couple of questions, and these are not book related, but certainly life mission related. And, you've built quite the life for yourself at a very young age, and should be incredibly proud of that. So how do you want to be remembered? In other words, fast forward to the end of a very full, very fulfilling life. What would you like for people to say at your funeral? If somebody's reading your eulogy, what would they say about Nick?
That Nick was useful. He had a positive impact on the people around him and the community that he serves. That's probably it.
Simple.
Useful,
yeah.
and had a positive impact.
Love it. Love it. And then before we find out how people can get in touch with you, last question. If you had a magic wand and you could make one material change to the world, one material change to our world as we know it, how would the world be different according to Nick?
My brain goes to, I wish people were more accepting. One of the things that I've realized over the last couple of years, and I've read this in so many different places, but as you zoom out and as you look at Earth as like this little tiny, almost meaningless thing in a huge, vast sea of other planets and, whatever, you realize that so many of the things that bother us on a day-to-day basis, or culturally from state to state, political party to political party, like they're pretty meaningless. Most of us have more in common with each other than we do with like the politicians that we think are supporting us. And I don't like to see the negativity, the hate, the divisiveness. I wish we were all more accepting of other people. Again, back to the Tim Ferriss thing, like we should all be able to design a life that's uniquely fulfilling to us and be less judgmental about how other people choose to live their lives, like as long as it doesn't negatively impact us. I think a big piece of that is gratitude. One of my favorite quotes is, it's not happy people that are grateful, but it's grateful people that are happy. Meaning gratitude is an action. It's a practice. It's a habit that you should participate in. It's a lead measure that leads to a lag of happiness. And as I express more gratitude in my daily practices and weekly practices, I'm just less judgmental of how other people choose to live their lives. I'm grateful for what I have, not what I lack. I don't compare myself to other people as much. And I wish more people had that sort of like centrist attitude, politically, socially, internationally. The world would be a better place if we did a little bit more of that.
Not a doubt about it. Not a doubt about it. Yeah. Thank you for that. I know there are going to be people that are going to want to follow you, connect with you, obviously, buy your book, Rise of the Reader. So if people listening to this, and we'll put it in the show notes too, so we'll put it in there so they can just click on it. But how can people find you?
Well, I appreciate the interview today, Roger. I just wanted to start by saying that. Show some gratitude for you, for the thoughtful questions, for having me on the show, and for putting this out around the book launch. All of those are meaningful things that I'm grateful for. So for people that want to connect with me, how about this? If you want a custom book recommendation from me, because you've heard today's conversation, you want to get back into reading, or you want to be a little bit more intentional with your reading, but you're not sure where to start, DM me at BookThinkers on Instagram in the show notes and tell me about a problem that you're facing that you just can't get rid of, or tell me about a skill that you want to develop that you just haven't made any progress on, or something in between. Yeah. I'll probably ask some follow-up questions, but I will provide a custom book recommendation and act as your accountability partner. I have a whole little spreadsheet system and follow up in 30 and 60 days to see if you've read the book, because this is what motivates me. I want other people to realize that the right book at the right time can change your life, especially if you implement it correctly. So that's where people can go to kind of get in touch with me. And from there are links in the bio and in the description for the book and everything else in my universe.
Love it. Love it. Nick, thank you for your time today. You are, like you said, you are wise beyond your years because of what's behind you, and but you present it in a very humble way. So strong appreciation for that, man. Thank you for being on the ThriveMore podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any resources mentioned during the show. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. I'd also like to remind you to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, always remember to set your intentions for the day and strive to thrive.